Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. We really appreciate that you guys are here with us today. Especially thank you to our guests for being here and giving us your time. Before we start, as I am representing Agsm Social Impact Club and the University of New South Wales Business School, we would like to acknowledge the Bidjigal as the traditional custodians of the land of the University of New South Wales Kensington campus. We acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past and present, and their communities who have shared and practiced their teaching over thousands of years, including business practices. We recognize Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, ongoing leadership and contributions, including to business, education, and industry. With that said, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit how we're going to do the event today. I'm going to introduce our guests very shortly, and then they're going to do a little bit of a presentation and share their personal journeys into the industry. And from there, we're going to jump into a Q&A. I was going to say that you can hold your questions until the end, but due to the fact that we are so few of us, I think you can shoot a question. Okay. So let's start with our first guest, Lisa Terry. Lisa is a Careers and Corporate Relationship Manager for the MBA Programs and Management Education at the University of Sydney. She is also the founder and Managing Director of Turning Green, a career consultancy and placement firm. And she also created Intention 21, which is a hub providing online support in careers management strategies. She's a sustainability career expert, and she's also, very proudly, an Agsm alumni. Our next speaker is Anya Solovieva. Anya is currently working for the e-commerce team at ICAP, where she focuses on product development and sales for electronic trading platforms in the Asia-Pacific region. She is very focused on the development of a secondary market for green bonds, and she will explain us a little bit more about that. Before this role, Anya was an international development consultant in the US, where she had the opportunity to work with the World Bank, USA, and the United Nations Development Program as well. She holds a Master's in Sustainability degree from the University of Sydney. And she's also completing a diploma on financial markets. Last but not least is our guest, Ben Waters. Ben is working on a sustainability and clean tech roles portfolio in projects. He has a vast experience in different angles, from engineer to sustainability businesses, strategy, investment, and footprint, especially doing his role in GE, which I think you can explain that to us. And also, a very interesting fact, Ben served as an engineering officer for the Royal Australian Air Force. He was awarded as the Executive Leader of the Year in 2011 for Climate Alliance Business Leadership Awards. He's an honorary industry fellow at the UTS Business School, member of Strategic Consulting and Climate Institute, and so on. And he has a bachelor's in aerospace engineering. So thank you very much for coming, and with that I will leave you with Lisa.
Thank you very much, and good evening everyone. Thanks for coming along to listen to us tonight. So I've got a presentation that that is career focused. Obviously, being a careers and recruitment person, I'm going to look at the approach to how not to use PowerPoint. Hang on one second. That was the last slide. Here we go. Right. So I think I've already been described in terms of my background. What I like to sort of get people thinking about first and foremost is I'm going to share sort of quite a lot of information, because I want to sort of ask people to think about, what their vision is for their own career, and how your role is aligned with that vision. And if not, then that's something to sort of think about. And then when you start thinking about your role now and into the future, is that aligned with your values and what you hold close, and the values of the organisation that you're working for? So there's sort of things to start thinking about. I then sort of look at the general employment trends on a macro level, because when we start thinking about our careers, it's always good to know the backdrop against which we're sort of operating against. And at the moment, sort of trends from last month, we can see that unemployment has remained steady at 6.2%. Job advertisements are now 7.9% higher over the last year, and that suggests that labour market conditions are continuing to gradually improve. And by comparison, thinking back to, I did this presentation in May, the figures were slightly worse. Advertising had declined sharply because of the uncertainty and adverse news flows related to the Commonwealth budget at that time. So these things are sort of quite important to take into consideration when you're looking at the marketplace, and not to blame yourself if the flow of activity is slower. So in the context of that, there's a great book that I use when I'm working with students called The Startup Review, and it's written by the founders of LinkedIn, and it really gets you thinking about the assets you have, your aspirations and your values against the backdrop of those market realities. So that's just the sort of bigger picture things. Coming on to sustainability, because that's what we're talking about tonight, when I look out there in the marketplace for information around sustainability trends in Australia, there really isn't a lot at the moment current. The reports that I had to draw upon were from overseas, from Greenbiz Group from America, and also a sustainability survey out of the UK. And we can see from that sustainability has definitely matured inside corporations, and it's associated now with value creation and not just a cost to be managed. And that has implications for people who want to move into that area or who are working in that area. And we certainly need that thorough understanding of business. There's an opportunity, as I said earlier, to align your values with a corporation. And that sort of culture shift that we're seeing in organisations now, the fact that sustainability is maturing has a flow-on effect on culture. And I think it's a lot of sustainability roles focus on that employee engagement piece. It's always a challenge to sort of communicate what sustainability means and how that translates into the roles that people are doing across an organisation. And that employee engagement works really well in some situations, and in other cases not so much. So it's good to track what's working and where the positive outcomes are coming. So I've got a copy here that you can have a look at later, but we did when I was running my business, we did a salary survey back in 2011, and again, looking out in the marketplace now, there's nothing sort of available since then that I could find. And I actually worked on this with Anya. Anya was working with me in the business at the time, which is just a coincidence that we're here tonight together. The key issues that were driving business activity around then, as you can see from number 1 to number 7, have changed quite dramatically. Not dramatically, but carbon and energy management have certainly dropped out entirely of the top 5 categories from a 2014 salary survey from the UK. So the top areas of focus for in-house staff are pretty much the same as areas for consultancy staff in terms of strategy development, reporting and performance measurement, environment, stakeholder engagement, auditing and assurance. And later on we'll come on and have a look at the competencies that are required to enter these organisations, and then the impact and how those competencies change in terms of having an impact once in. So what does it mean for you in terms of these trends that we've looked at? Interestingly, the number of companies adding a full-time sustainability manager is decreasing, and budgets are shrinking. And when I sort of read that, first of all, I was a bit sort of disheartened. But then the Greenbiz Group report that I was reading went on to sort of clarify things around that there's actually an opportunity to start a project and transfer it to another group just because you haven't got direct funding, or you're not hiring a new sustainability manager in. Existing sustainability leaders are also actively hiring because they can articulate their needs better, and they, rather than just sort of lumping those responsibilities across an organisation, they can actually hire specialist staff in. And we've seen that in the increase in energy managers from 48% in 2011 to 52% in 2012. So that is a positive story about perhaps initially a disappointing one. Another framework that I was quite heartened to see was from 2009, the Harvard Business School's paper, Why Sustainability is Now the Key Driver of Innovation. I remember reading this back in 2009 and actually using it as a model when sort of working with clients. And to see this still being sort of spoken and shared now is also quite positive. And it's taking you through the stages where companies really start viewing compliance as an opportunity. You really look at those value chains and making those sustainable, designing sustainable products and services, developing new business models, and creating next practice platforms. And there's a lot of information on that slide, but I'm happy to share this slide with you afterwards, or the presentation afterwards with you if it helps. So looking at education, qualifications, career history, that sort of thing, what's the most sort of important competencies that companies are looking for when they're actually looking to hire you in? From an in-house perspective, it starts with engaging with stakeholders, as opposed to on the consultancy side, they're really looking at that strategic strength. On the in-house side, influencing and persuading. Once you're in-house, you've got those stakeholders that are constantly living with you day in, day out, so it's really important to be able to influence. Whereas on the consulting side, we're looking more at the research piece. Again, in-house, we're then moving into that planning and developing strategy once we've got the buy-in from the broader stakeholder base. And then on the consulting side, engaging with the stakeholders that you've done your research on, and you know the people that are critical to executing your strategies. Research and analysis comes next in-house, project management on the consulting side, project management last on the in-house side, and then influencing and persuading on the consulting side. And then once in-house, when you're in-house, the impact that you have once you're in the role moves again to engaging with stakeholders for the in-house position, and pretty much doesn't change until the measuring and reporting side, because obviously the work's been done, and measuring that work and reporting on that is critical. And then that continual sort of program management of those projects is also key. And then on the consulting side, the impact that you can have once you're in, remains number one, always developing and planning strategy, but then more so engaging with the stakeholders, influencing, persuading, research and analysis, and project management. Yeah?
Yeah, these competencies are for general careers or focus on careers in sustainability?
These are in-house roles, so if you were in a sustainability management position in-house, or a CSR role in-house, and a consulting practice, delivering sustainability solutions.
Oh.
Yeah, this was from the Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability Salary Survey report in the UK, yeah.
Thanks.
So they interviewed a number of practitioners in the field across both sides. So it's interesting to get to see what these outcomes were. So another thing I sort of suggest that people do then, if they're considering a career in sustainability, and I think Ben will go into a bit of detail around this as well, and then we'll dive deeper into the industry sector that I'm using. But it's really important to take a step back and look at where the jobs in your area are from a geographical perspective, and also the industry status. And I know that Ben's had a lot of experience in this area as well, in terms of, is the area at research and development stage, is it emerging, is it very established? And that's going to really have a knock-on effect as to which roles are going to be available and the type of positions that are going to be available to you. So this is just a flow of typical job categories. Now my focus has historically been very much in the far right corner, so CSR and sustainability in business, but obviously there's a broad array of positions across environment, health and safety, energy and carbon. And those roles exist in business as well, but I've been focused on the corporate sustainability side. So this was a really good overview to see which groups have a positive impact on advancing sustainability. Obviously large corporations are in the lead there, and International Integrated Reporting Council right at the bottom. Now, I was quite surprised at that, but I think that it just goes to show that the impact of reporting from an advancing sustainability as an issue on a global scale. Reporting is great, but it's very much a ticking the box exercise as opposed to actually being innovative, having new ideas. At the Sustainability Conference in Melbourne the other week, we heard a lot from chemical companies who were working in hand with commercial organisations to help them to source sustainable fibres, better fibres and materials for their products. So I think Kimberly Clark had about 50% Forestry Stewardship Council materials for their paper, and they're working with BASF in partnership to look at alternative and innovative solutions around improving that. So in terms of remuneration, these are sort of general salaries, mean, median, mode from the UK, 2014. So the mean global salary value is about 110. If we look at role specific, and this is, I did convert this to Australian dollars, the director head of an in-house operation is on average 220, but I've seen those roles as high as 500,000 up to $1 million with bonuses as well, and you've got a real sort of global remit. And obviously that seems quite low for a partner position, but this is what was reported on from the UK, but I think partnership positions in consulting firms can go up a hell of a lot higher than that. The sustainability roles and salary survey that we did in 2011 added CPI inflation to this because I said there wasn't anything available since that time. So the director head of in-house, we're looking at 230, and the partner goes up to 208. And obviously you're limited to the statistics that you're working with in terms of the participants of those surveys. So looking at the future, there still seems to be a high demand around efforts to reduce energy consumption if we're looking at shareholders and their inquiries. Publishing of a sustainability report is still quite high, which again is interesting considering the bottom end of the Global Reporting Initiative in the previous slide. Working conditions and human rights, we're obviously seeing things progress in terms of the Bangladesh factory disaster and lots of other initiatives that are supporting protection of human rights in production lines. And obviously financial risk associated with climate change, which Anya's going to talk about in her presentation. So the barriers and challenges, and I spoke to quite a few practitioners in the field about this, and there aren't any surprises here in terms of the barriers and challenges, not in the field anyway. If you talk to any sustainability practitioner, they'll agree with most of these. But I was hearing in the marketplace that it is quite hard in these roles, particularly strategic employee engagement. But like I said earlier, I think if you take note of what works and follow great case studies and best practice, it's definitely the best way forward. And I always advise that people take control of their own careers and really drive themselves forward through these challenges and accept that it's not always going to be easy, especially in sustainability. That stakeholder engagement piece is really key, and that can be quite challenging, can be quite draining, so it's always important to have groups like this, camaraderie. We have a lot of conferences, sustainability drinks and get-togethers with fellow practitioners to share stories and keep spirits high. So sustainability leaders are going to be spending their time in defining materiality, and by that we mean what's important in terms of reporting, what is key to the organisation addressing, what are the key issues that the organisation should be addressing, what are a priority, valuable nature, Non-toxic partnerships. I had a question about that the other week, so I've got a handout here if anyone's interested in that, because it's quite technical to go into. I won't go into that now, but I've just got that as back up there should you have any more questions around that or want to explore further. And being across the convergence of systems, technology and big data, and the impact on jobs and the skills required in those areas. So in addition to Masters in Sustainability, MBAs, the offer of skills and training, there are organisations. Sustainability.edu.au has a great database where you can go in and actually put in for whatever specific skills that you want to develop in this field. You can go and do short courses. The ACCSR do great short courses on the technical aspects of sustainability if you want to dive deeper. The Centre for Sustainability Leadership, I would say, tend to, if you're in a corporation, you go and do their course, you end up leaving and going and starting a company and changing your whole life and travelling around the world doing different things. So I would say that's not a very good retention course to do. The EINZ, the Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand, is very environmentally focused from a technical perspective. And the Carbon Training International, you're looking at carbon management, the real technical side of valuing emissions and measuring emissions and carbon. And then there's other career groups there as well on the list. So I think it's important if you're looking to go into this field to know your story and how to tell it. Anya's story is really interesting in that I'll let her tell it, but she is not working in sustainability right now, but she'll explain to you how she's leveraged her qualifications, her interests and her passions, and she's actually affecting change in a way that I won't steal her thunder, I'll let her tell you. But that's a story that's unfolded since I've known her, since she's arrived in Australia, and she's doing incredibly well and not in a direct sustainability path. And I thought this was really interesting. This is Rupert Davis, who's a senior headhunter from a company called, let's forget, Sustainable Needs. He's over in the States. And he said to lock the strategic value in sustainability, you need to be a trusted internal partner to C-suite and credibly speak the language of growth, financial opportunity, innovation, entrepreneurship, and profit and loss. And also to understand issues and be credible in the stakeholder universe. So they're not asking a lot really of sustainability practitioners. And a great CSO or head of sustainability is someone who can think like a marketer, a CFO, an early stage entrepreneur, a politician and a top strategy consultant, and very specifically apply that to the culture of the firm at hand. So it is a challenging area, but I think that's what makes it so continually engaging, and it's a really rewarding career to be in, but it's not easy. I always finish with that slide. So I think if you look after yourself, then you can sort of navigate all those challenges and those problems much better. So, okay, that's it. Thank you. Should we just do questions as we go? Yeah.
Yeah, so we can go to any presentation.
Yeah, perfect. So we won't talk about the overview, but just to tell you a little bit about my story, my journey, and what I'm doing now. So as previously as mentioned, I actually did my undergraduate studies in the US, and right after I moved into an international development consultancy called MSI. We are one of the largest in the world. We're actually owned by an Australian company called Coffee. I worked in the company for 2 years in a business development role, so we were focusing on writing proposals. I think I worked over like 42 proposals in my 2 years there, ranging from USAID, World Bank, etc., etc. Unfortunately, throughout my work, I got very disillusioned with the effectiveness of many international development projects around the world, particularly those focused on economic development and economic progress. Which I think is kind of the key fundamental to bring individuals out of poverty, at least from my experience and my study. So once I kind of identified this challenge in international development for myself, I said, okay, well, I've got to move away from that, but what and who can actually affect the change? And what I identified were corporations. So I thought, okay, well, it's actually corporations are the ones that are giving individuals jobs. They're the
that need to actually have better operations in the environments in which they operate, particularly in developing countries, etc. So I kind of went on this journey and thought, okay, how do I then transition? It's very difficult transitioning out of Washington DC. International development is a very tight-knit community. You essentially get judged if you move away, if you go to the corporate sector, etc. And I actually should mention that I actually worked for a for-profit consultancy, which in the development circles, for-profit consultancies are identified as more effective. So it's interesting that I actually had these feelings about ineffectiveness of projects in a consultancy that was considered actually one of the best. And that's not to say that there wasn't really good work that they were doing. We actually had a massive project in Iraq. We were doing it's essentially ministry capacity building. There's a lot of really effective and positive change that came out of that. But I'm speaking particularly from an economic perspective and economic focused projects. So I then moved to Australia, wanting to move into what I thought then was going to be the corporate social responsibility sector. Following on more of the research that I did around this. So for the first year in Australia, essentially I contacted people on LinkedIn and started having coffees and finding consulting opportunities. So anything to pay the bills, which is actually how I came across Lisa. I did some really interesting projects with her, Lisa is actually instrumental in broadening my network and actually putting me in touch with some very interesting individuals. And I had one mentor, a gentleman by the name of David Morrissey, who actually kind of sat me down. He was like, look, if you want to have credibility in this space, coming from an international development background, you probably need to go do your master's, which is when I decided to do my master's in sustainability. And really the primary reason was to better have an understanding of the subject matter. A lot of it you can read yourself, but when you are presented in a more structured way, you have a better, broader understanding of it. But then also to be able to then say, which is exactly what I've done now, is saying, well, I've got a master's in sustainability, so I know what I'm talking about. And from what I've actually discovered in the financial markets and the financial sector, it's worth a lot. So let's pretend that we won't keep the truth actually from them. But so then I did my master's in sustainability, and throughout my program, what I actually discovered throughout my research was that it actually wasn't corporations that were the driver of the change. It was actually the investors. So without the investors, the corporation isn't going to act. You're not going to get a CFO or a CEO to do anything. So all of my research essentially throughout my master's program was focused on the investor perspective and how investors can actually push corporations to change, what are their touch points, what are their drivers, etc. So finishing my master's program, I realized, okay, well, I want to go into the responsible investment sector. I don't have a background in finance. What do I do? Fortunately, I was actually offered an opportunity with this company called ICAP. So we are the largest interdealer broker in the world. What that means is we manage transactions between banks. So traders, when they trade any asset class, we're the brokers they go through. So essentially, we're a fundamental piece of the secondary markets in all asset classes globally. We are the largest, operating in 32 countries. So forth. So their opportunity actually offered me, so the opportunity that was offered to me was to work across all asset classes to really get to understand finance from the inside. And I particularly work on the electronic trading platform. So I'm responsible for our fixed income platform in Asia. So primarily it's Australian bonds. This is kind of our biggest one. We've been running it since 2001. It's incredibly successful. And very well recognized. So, and the difference actually, so I'll tell you, the reason I went to a broker as opposed to a bank, which would probably have been kind of more logical, is because a bank would have siloed me into one asset class, and that would have been my focus, whilst a broker allowed me the opportunity to get to know all of the asset classes. We actually don't focus on equities in Australia, but kind of the equities knowledge you can get other places, I feel. But some of the basics, like how do interest rates influence the world, foreign exchange, etc. So, and then just a little over a year ago, through kind of networking within my own company and having my voice heard saying, I have a Master of Sustainability, I want to do something around green. I was connected with our managing director of a Frankfurt office who was essentially, who came across these green bonds. So let me tell you a little bit more about green bonds. So we'll skip all this. So green bonds are a new emerging asset class, super exciting, super hot. Everyone's talking about them. The first one was issued by the World Bank in 2008. As you can see here, the trajectory last year, there you go. So last year there was 11 billion issued. The first corporate bond, I'm sure you guys are all master's students, so you all know what bonds are. I gave a lecture for the Master of Sustainability students, and my first question is, what's a bond? Okay, let's take it back. So, so last year there was 11 billion issued, and primarily by essentially the World Bank. In November of last year, EFD, which is a massive French utility company, they went and issued the first one. Yep. This then caused a snowballing effect for more companies because it was, I think it was 2 or 3 times oversubscribed. Investors weren't compromising on the yield, and it was essentially trading at par to any other bonds. So they were saying, wow, fantastic, we can be investing in green. It looks fantastic from a marketing perspective, but we're not compromising on our returns. What can be better? So, and from a corporation point of view, what they started to see, so then afterwards, Toyota issued one, so it was actually quite big, I think it was like 1.1 billion, and essentially the financing was raised to ring fence for hybrid vehicle loans. Really interesting use of it. But otherwise, I mean, they could have just gone to the normal debt markets and just gotten a normal bond. However, this attracted a broader range of investors. So in 2013 we had 11 billion. We're nearly, I think the last figure I saw was like 35.8 billion issued so far. So we're about to hit, we're confident we're going to hit the 40 billion mark, and the projections are for 100 billion next year.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Is this the global market we're talking about, or
global
is it
market.
ICAP's play in the market?
So no, so we don't. So our role in the market at the moment is we write a weekly kind of a weekly summary. We also price the top 35 most liquid but they're illiquid bonds, because at the moment what we're seeing is as soon as the bond is issued, 2 to 3 times oversubscribed, it's buy and hold. No one's selling them. However, as we know, in order to actually grow a market, we need to have development of secondary market. So we're hoping that, and we know that as more issuance start happening, there's obviously going to be competitive pricing. So some people are going to want to sell, and they're going to obviously need a buyer. So we're positioning ourselves to essentially to manage those transactions when they do start happening. At the moment, they're not, which is kind of the biggest challenge for me to sell. That as a broker, it's all about brokerage. At the moment, I'm going, well, we can't. Yeah.
But is it because the corporates need to have a story behind that, which is a green story behind that, which they may today the reporting norms are not there, or whatever is there?
Honestly, from what I've seen, it's not about the reporting story. It's about they need the financing. They want to raise this money for. I think, this is my own personal opinion, that a lot of the projects that the green bonds have financed are projects that might have happened anyway, but they just needed the financing to support them. For example, Unilever, they issued a green bond to retrofit a couple of the factories in the developing world, like South Africa, Ukraine, to make them more water efficient and energy efficient. So obviously, from a corporation's point of view, they're saving money. They love it. And from an investor point of view, they're getting a competitive return. So it's a win-win. So I mean, actually had a great video from Bloomberg TV, which one of the Zurich fund managers who's going, the lady asked him, well, what do you see as the risks with these green bonds? And he goes, absolutely nothing. The biggest challenge at the moment is around is around identifying what a green bond is, because the most important thing, we want to avoid this issue of greenwashing. We don't want this asset class to be mislabeled, because as soon as it does, it's going to lose all credibility. So there are green bond principles that the banks, the original signatories, I believe it was 13 or 14 original banks, they issued green bond principles on January 13th of this year. Now it's close to 50 banks that have signed up to that, which is pretty exciting, that so many of the signatories in a very short period of time. So
that would actually be my question. What kind of basic criteria does a bond have to meet to be a green bond, and who is controlling whether this criteria is actually met?
Yeah.
Once the bank is or once the company has the funds.
Yeah. So the way that the bond is defined is for projects that are for the purposes of climate mitigation or climate adaptation, obviously a massively broad criteria. So one of the green bond principles, one of, I guess, the criticisms against it was that they didn't define specific criteria. The reason being is that different banks, so the different underwriters define the criteria in different ways. So it's actually completely up at the moment, because it's not legally binding. So it's up to the corporation to define it, to ring fence that financing, and then for the underwriter or the investor, whoever bought the funds, to actually ask for reports and to follow up and to ensure that that money goes to where it's supposed to be, which is obviously a challenge then on the corporation to ensure that it adds extra costs in terms of reporting and making sure that that money stays where it is. But that's like the main issue at the moment in question. But the corporations that are issuing it, they're making it quite public. So if they were to renege on their, on their commitments, then it would be quite a big challenge. But actually, what I also want to mention, which is really interesting, is that it's actually not only corporations that have kind of gotten onto this, but it's also, just forget that, but it's also cities and states. For example, the city of Johannesburg, they issued one. Washington, D.C. issued one in order to improve their water and sewage system with a maturity of 100 years, which is pretty big, because there's very little there's not that many 100-year bonds, so investors were really excited about that with a really competitive rate. Yeah.
Two questions. One is, what sort of duration are these bonds?
Everything. So, like I said, Washington, D.C., 100 years. Most of the ones we're seeing at the moment are about 5 to 10 years maturity.
Second, isn't there a little bit of a game theory thing going on, in a sense of everyone's fighting for capital, so
yep.
And so almost like with the car industry, where they're all saying, "Oh, we're the safest," and they're just not necessarily making dramatic improvements, but rather branding theirs as.
Well, that would be the issue of greenwashing. So at the moment, the bonds that we're seeing, that the banks, this is not just we as ACA, but the banks are not seeing that risk, that there's a lot of due diligence that goes into identifying these projects. So, and
But are the projects any better than they were before? It would be the question.
Well, they're just able to get the financing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah, it's better or not. I don't know, but it's definitely the fact that they're able to get the financing, and that they can diversify their investor base, which is so key.
It almost seems like more about segmentation than about an actual new product. Right? It's more about just splitting an existing market. Would that be fair?
A new product in terms of a financial product?
Yeah. Do you think that actually money's actually flowing in, or as a consequence of this split?
Well, I think money is flowing into the projects. I don't know if more money is flowing in just yet. I think actually no, because a lot of the investors are sustainability investors, so they're particularly SRI funds. So in that case, it would be actually adding additional funds, because those SRI funds wouldn't invest in a normal project. So I think from that perspective, if you look at it, then yeah, it would be. And a lot of the, it depends on which bond, but sometimes it could be as big as 70% SRI funds in investing in companies that they might have otherwise not invested. And banks as well are actually issuing, like Bank of America, Lloyd's, and they're issuing these bonds in order to be able to give loans for clean tech projects, which is also really, it's just a means of them getting that money.
Sorry, Anya, what's an SRI fund?
So Socially Responsible Investment Fund.
Okay.
Yeah. So they are growing in size. And they're becoming a lot more prominent. And actually, what I'll say, so I finished my master's in 2010, and when I was looking, 2012. And when I was kind of looking at responsible investment, a lot of the conversations weren't there. I think people weren't ready, especially in Australia. But I would say that even from a conventional, just like, for example, a fixed income salesperson, they have to know what these green bonds are now, which 2 years ago they didn't, and they didn't care. And so the approach is it's changing. And especially, I'm sure you guys have heard about the divestment story, so divestment for fossil fuels. So that's also now fueling conversations as well, but that's from an equities perspective. Yeah.
So isn't it the subtle strategy by, say, someone like Unilever to raise capital when they are setting up their plant in, for example, South Africa?
Yeah.
And if the bond fails to raise enough capital, isn't this a nice way to create buy-in with the South African government? So the South African government supports it.
Yeah, so actually it's really interesting. So the Climate Bonds Initiative, so if you guys are interested more in this topic, I would look up the Climate Bonds Initiative. They're the NGO that's really kind of behind this. Sean Kidney is fantastic, who's the CEO of that organization. So what they're actually doing is working with governments to try to get more government tax incentives, particularly for these green bonds. And for example, China, the chief economist in China, he's actually mentioned green bonds as a really unique, new, emerging, and exciting asset class that could be used in order to finance all these really necessary projects. So absolutely, definitely. And the fact that city governments, it's also an ability for them to raise really critical funds, which I think especially for municipalities and cities, it's actually quite difficult oftentimes to get that financing. And this is actually a mechanism for them to get that necessary money because the investors are there. I mean, I have not heard of a single bond that wasn't at least 2 times oversubscribed, and within very short periods of time as well, like hours sometimes. So the road shows of these, I mean, the underwriters, and that's the thing, so all the global banks are just, I mean, they're falling over themselves to try to get these deals. So the Swedish bank, SEB, they were the ones that were on the forefront of it. They're still one of the main in the top 10, and I think they're actually still number 1, but they're slowly falling behind. I mean, JP Morgan, HSBC, Goldman Sachs, SocGen, they're all getting behind this, which is fantastic. And it's all also driven by their normal fixed income sales teams as well. And so the one Aussie one that was issued back in March was an IBRD bond, but it was underwritten by Westpac and RBC. So, and then Stockland just issued one like a month ago, but it was a US denominated one, but it's still an Australian company. So, I think I way talked over. But yeah. So if you guys have any more, I love to tell people about green bonds. If you do have any questions, I'm happy to give my contact details, but I can send you more information if you're interested. But this is definitely a developing field, so yeah, it's huge.
With that, please, let's receive the end. I think you don't have any slides.
No,
just gonna talk
is that all right?
Yeah, perfect.
Put my notes down here, I can hang out at the front, what do you reckon? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here, I'm just here for diversity purposes. I thought I should start with how I got here, a little career story, because as you said, I was an aeronautical engineer at the Defence Academy, which happens to be a college of the Uni of New South Wales, and in its first year in 1986, and finished up with an aeronautical engineering degree, actually from RMIT. I'll tell you about it later. A bit later than that, and went into the Air Force and was managing fleets of aircraft, military aircraft engines, one of which happened to be made by GE. So after 7 years in the Air Force and working 11 years total, I became the GE Field Service Engineer on base at Williamtown, 100 miles north of here, looking after military aircraft engines. Did that for 6 or 7 years, it was a pretty cool job. Then they got me to sell aircraft engines for airlines. I came to Sydney in 2002 and was selling initially to Virgin Blue in its early days, and to Air New Zealand after its near-death experience, after it bought Ansett, that didn't go so good. And then eventually to Qantas, and eventually did sell some stuff to Qantas in 2007 or 8. And they tend to be billion-dollar deals when they come. So G was pleased with this and asked me to be their commercial director across Australia and New Zealand, which is an impossible job, is trying to coordinate, the guys selling aircraft engines and trains and energy gas turbines and G money, consumer finance and capital, which is most of the company here, and light bulbs and stuff. And it doesn't, but it was bloody interesting, and you learn a lot about a lot of different industries. And that was fun because I was sort of intellectually curious. And I was looking for something that sort of, what does, binds all this stuff together in terms of, commercial strength. And G has good leadership training, so that's sort of good like that, but it doesn't mean the industries have anything in common. So I said, what do your customers care about? Sales 101 on the commercial side is understanding what your customer does to make money and then helping them make some more of it. What have we got in common? All of our customers are probably hit by the big industry transitions that are going on around the world, are hit by the mega trends. And the one that I've zeroed in on is sustainability. Look, I got to sustainability not by accident. I think it's going to be sort of important in the next century or so. And our customers have that common need to do more with less, is the way I think of it, on the environmental sense. So I got to sustainability by perhaps a circuitous route. I started doing it in my spare time, even when I was selling aircraft engines, and did a lot of work with the Qantas environment team, a lot of work on aviation biofuels. A bit later on, I got interested in electric cars, electrification of transport, decentralisation of energy, significant trends that are disruptive to incumbent industries. So I think that's interesting. But thinking about how we're depleting our natural capital, how we're also depleting our human capital, as you heard about with inequality and the human rights in Bangladesh and places. That's pretty important for business to realise strategically that those things are going on, and if you sort of participate in that, that's really not a very good business strategy. So business can be at the forefront of the effort to improve those things, or not. It can resist it. And actually in Australia we've got a lot of business resisting change, resisting needed change as we evolve our industries. And sort of hanging on to the past, hanging on to what made us successful. Here's a lesson: what made you successful doesn't keep you successful. You have to continually reinvent yourself as a person, as a company, as a nation. And hanging on to the past, the most powerful companies, the most powerful people got successful doing the old thing. They're not going to win. They're very loud and good at stopping change for a while, but the change is inevitable, and generational change will happen, and the businesses will change, and the country will change. So, look, it's just good business to think about what's coming over the horizon, not just think short term. Think a bit broader, to think a bit longer. It's just good business to anticipate what your customers are going to need in a transitioned new economy, and to innovate, as Lisa said, and to differentiate yourself. Firstly by reducing your impact on human capital and environmental capital, but also help your customers. You've probably got a bigger lever by helping your customers do more with less. And Lisa's Harvard study confirms about that stuff, that sustainability is associated with innovation. That's certainly what I found. Working in GE and its Seek Imagination initiative, we were big on collaborative innovation. It was really an R&D commitment, and GE invested $5 billion in clean technologies between 2005 and 2010 and made $120 billion doing it. And then invested $10 billion in R&D in the next 5-year period, and going to make a lot more than that. So that's pretty good business. At the same time, reducing its footprint, reducing its costs by about $150 million a year, less energy, less water, essentially, less supply chain. That looks like a good business initiative. Costs are down, the revenues are up, and you're investing for the future and staying, I guess, ahead of the curve. A lot of businesses always running to catch up. If you can get ahead and have the others trailing you, that's probably a good thing. So I think sustainability is about good business strategy. It's often seen as it's about compliance. It's about sort of, a ticket to entry. It's cleanliness, reporting and stuff. But actually increasingly, and again, pleasing that Lisa showed this, I think sustainability is becoming more about business strategy, about value creation, about understanding your customers, strategic marketing. I think it has a lot more powerful that way. And the profession is starting to mature, and increasingly sustainability people are doing those sort of strategic jobs. I heard a smart bloke, American, who runs a corporate eco-centre, saying that the CSO is a pretty important role in many new organisations, many big organisations. Can mean Chief Strategy Officer, can mean Chief Sustainability Officer, it's actually the same thing. Companies in Australia are starting to get a bit more like that, and I see good things happening in the property sector. LJ Hooker done some great stuff recently on sustainability of people's houses, got livability. The insurance sector has got climate in particular for a long time, and IAG are doing great things around shared value. It's all, you can choose whichever jargon you like, but I think of it as sustainability. Sometimes I think it's going to take generational change when I see the business organisations resisting, carbon pricing and renewable energy and stuff that's obviously going to happen. Australian organisations and businesses seem more than others to be resisting that needed change, and it's as if we have to, okay.
Sorry, I'm not from Australia, and I keep seeing, when I'm on the internet, a lot of campaigning from petrochemical companies, like the Chevron advert that keeps coming up and saying, we agree, it says something like, we agree that local is important, and we agree that Chevron is local. And I've seen, besides Chevron, there's I think it's Shell or one of the others talking about like campaigning for shale gas. What is that? Might be a tangent, but what is the resistance in Australia? Why are the petrochemical companies campaigning in Australia?
I think you can see some push back against coal seam gas in particular, against fossil fuels in general. I think that's reasonably rational. Having said that, our economy at the moment runs on fossil fuels. Australia's heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. Without importing oil, we've got a trade surplus. With it, we've got a 40 billion trade deficit. So local fossil fuels, it's rational to do that. But longer term view, you're going to have to be transitioning away from them. I think we know that by the end of the century, we've got to be largely off fossil fuels. I think the world understands that.
I just thought campaigning was an unusual move. Normally you just invest in if you believe it to be right, you just invest.
I think that's, in one way a smart move by the oil and gas company to be on the front foot with the marketing campaign, but I suggest an even smarter move would be to be investing in alternative energies, as BP was 10 years ago, but isn't anymore.
But
beyond petroleum was quite a
they're
long time.
campaigning for things like shale gas and stuff, but I don't know why they just don't do it. Like, what's the hurdle?
I think they're doing it, but they're also trying to influence their reputation in the local community, and I think it's a global thing. Do you think is that just an Australia thing, that Chevron campaign?
Yeah,
Is that what I thought?
I think it's quite unusual, that campaigning. Sorry, I don't want to create a tangent, but...
Yeah, well, look, I think what they're going at is creating a social licence to operate, and I think that's bloody important for businesses to do. I'm a bit cynical and suspicious about oil and gas companies that are doing what they've always done and say that we agree, and they're sort of throwing money at the problem without wanting to examine or change what their core business is. And I suggest they need to examine and consider changing what their core business is, eventually.
Thank you. I appreciate the presentation. I'm in supply chain and logistics here in Australia, and I'm a consultant. So what we do is we help companies redesign their supply chain. And as we all know, that supply chain isn't very environmentally friendly. And I work with big businesses to small businesses here in Australia. And whilst a lot of them are starting to shift towards corporate responsibility, it's more around our drivers, sleeping, all that kind of stuff. But in the 7 years of doing this, I have never heard a client, ever, and I've met with hundreds of them, ask me about the sustainability of any logistics provider we look at, any carrier or anything. Do you think that's because here in Australia, businesses don't yet perceive sustainability as being important to the public? And I'm talking about global companies. Never have I heard what's the environmental friendliness of carrier X or carrier Y, or this even the strategy that you're proposing?
I think there's a spectrum of adoption, and we're low on the curve on sustainable supply chain, certainly. And I think Europe in particular is ahead of us. And companies like Marks and Spencer are well known for sustainable supply chain. And in America, Walmart's having a good go at that. And I do see it starting to emerge. And I've talked to Australian B2C retailers around their sustainability strategies recently, and one of their big 3 pillars, and I won't name them, is a sustainable supply chain, because they see that as their big lever. Reduce your own carbon footprint, make sure your people are safe, obviously. But your big lever is probably influencing that huge supply chain that sits behind you. So I think it's coming. I think the better companies see it as a way of differentiating themselves. The businesses may not care about it, but when their customers start to care about it, they care about it pretty quick.
I want to suggest it sometimes when I'm dealing with these clients to help them competitive. Well, I want to help them create a point of difference.
Yeah.
But I'm mindful that I don't want to open up a can of worms and then for them to perceive me as being difficult.
Sure.
You know what I'm
Yeah,
saying?
no, I mean,
So-
you've got to, influence and persuasion was on Lisa's chart. To do it nicely, to do it by meeting the system where it's at, by using the language of the company, I think is the smart way to do it. I wouldn't be an activist inside the company. But if you can get some incremental change, that's better than no change. Evolution can beat revolution.
And positive case studies as well.
Yeah.
You can arm yourself with some positive case studies.
That's good.
Your
It's not
peers
keeping mine
understand you.
external.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
I'd like to emphasise the competitive advantage of doing it rather than the sort of the compliance nature of it. So it's coming. I saw it happen in GE over a number of years, and we wrote a lot of big tenders, and airlines and militaries were certainly asking for this 4 or 5 years ago, longer. And then I saw that creep in industry by industry when I was in that commercial job at GE. It's coming. The businesses for a while thought they didn't need it until their customers started asking about it, and then they need it in a hurry. So, and we're all customers too, so you can all sort of be part of that movement. Right? Let me just see what I was up to. Cool. Yes, generational change is sometimes what I think it needs. We've got a sort of this natural tension people portray between sustainability and the economy. I think that's a false choice. I think anyone who asks you to choose between the two, say, I want both. Choosing between one or the other is always a bad deal. It's not a good idea. This choice between economic development and the environment. Look, if economic development is bad for the environment or for societal, capital, then it's uneconomic development sooner or later. And that's actually a definition that came from the New South Wales Environment Minister, Rob Stokes, who's rather encouraging. Who would have thought New South Wales would be one of the first to see generational change in the politics, but new Premier, new Environment Minister, and Stokes, who's an environmental lawyer, described to us at a Sustainable Business Australia event, don't think of these things as opposites. The Venn diagram of sustainability, saying there's economy and there's society, and it's just that little bit in between the sustainability. No, it's not. The economy exists entirely surrounded by society, and it's there to serve society. And the society is surrounded by the environment, which is really just the stuff that's around you. It's a Russian dolls metaphor, not a Venn diagram, one's within the other. That was encouraging. So we need some, generational change in business, and I'd like to think that you guys can join me and go out there and help that. So, to get business to that point, I think, we've got to help by influencing and persuading internally in these businesses. We've got to help business think differently, to think a bit broader and to think a bit longer, is how I usually describe it. When I was in the Air Force, I was systems engineer. I was thinking about propulsion systems for airplanes, because you can bet that the pilot of the fighter didn't really care about that nut or that turbine over there or that system down there. He really cared about that. At the top level, was the system going to do what I needed to do to perform the mission? We need to think a bit like that in business and in society. We're full of people in business who think very narrowly about their silo. And I'm going to focus, and it's good to focus. But having people that can think across big systems, and yes, it's complicated, to think about the complex interrelationship between a bunch of different things and know a bit about marketing and a bit about business development and a bit about sales and a bit about engineering, that's sort of important. Think integratively across systems and think about change, considering all of those difficult, complex interreactions. I think of it as systems engineering in a way. Also, looking beyond your borders is pretty important. Collaborative innovation. At GE, I ran a big strategic alliance with CSIRO, $20 million, 5-year alliance between the two companies, looking for new innovation in aircraft engine materials and renewable energy, and we're also working on detecting Alzheimer's disease and some other stuff. So that was sort of broad. But they were broad and we were broad, and looking beyond your borders is pretty important, even for one of the biggest companies in the world. 300,000 people, 5 global research centres, and yet we were looking for answers in CSIRO because not invented here is a problem in companies. So,
I have a question in regards to energy sustainability.
Sure.
In Australia, whom do you see to make the first move? Where I come from is the business won't do it if it's if they're making a loss with it.
yeah.
The customer usually won't do it if they have to pay way more.
Yeah.
And then if you take Europe as an example, the energy sustainability is heavily subsidized by the government. But in Australia, you have Tony Abbott who says global warming is not existing. So whom do you see to move first in regards to
I think fundamental economics are going to rule that. All forms of energy have been subsidised by government, most of them still are. But the fundamentals behind renewables is that Australian electricity prices in Australia have doubled a bit more in the last 5 or so years. And the cost of solar in particular has gone down by over 80% in the same period, only because of mass production out of China. Those curves overlap, doesn't matter what government subsidies you got, the solar will take off, and that's been happening. There is some assistance for solar at the moment from the government. Even take that away, that price gap will be gone in a few years' time. And it just fundamentally is going to make sense with high electricity prices, a lot of sun, daytime loads. If you've got those things, solar's going to make sense sooner or later. I'm selling some solar at the moment. It makes sense for businesses. That's happened. It's 1.5 million houses in Australia with solar. It's a bigger market than the US solar market. That's happening. Can't be put back in the box much as you'd like it. And actually, it's quite a nice system if you've got local energy rather than generating it hundreds of miles away, very inefficiently, losing 2/3 of the energy of the fuel in heat, shipping the rest, losing 10% of it on the way, using it inefficiently. That wasn't really a competitive advantage, I don't think. If we had cheap energy because we had cheap coal, we used it inefficiently and actually had the same electricity bills as every other country. That wasn't a competitive advantage. What is using it efficiently and using your local resources rather than using that diminishing, once-off resource of fossil fuels.
But coming a little bit closer to what Frederick was asking, do you think, because I'm seeing this in emerging countries, do you think the key is actually to have a more active participation of public and private associations? So because sometimes the government is a little bit reluctant to give subsidies in order for some sustainable business to grow. And therefore, this form of new agents, which is the public and private association, sometimes is the key to that response.
Sure. Look, what I see is community renewable energy networks springing up, and I'm doing plenty of work on that at the moment. It's one of the things I'm doing is I've started a company that's around distributed energy and water solutions for precincts. So I think communities are starting to take control of that power. You've seen it happen in the Hepburn wind farm and a bunch of local solar schemes. So that's happening, and that's hard to stop as well. Though I mean, there's some regulatory and governance hurdles there, undoubtedly, but they can be solved.
Ben, could I actually just jump in on that public-partnership from an investor perspective? There's an amazing paper that was written by the World Economic Forum that was presented at the last one in Geneva in January, and it was all around looking at how do you actually influence clean energy technologies. And one of the biggest things is actually not even around incentives by governments, but it's actually around clear public policy around it. So it's actually clear, which is one of the reasons why Australia is massively struggling. And actually, I told you a fact earlier, but Australia actually has fallen from being 11th to 39 in clean energy investment in 2014. We're now behind Algeria and Myanmar. That's terrifying. And part of that is because of the instability in the government policy. But if you're interested in that topic, definitely look up this World Economic paper. It was it's a green investment, but they talk a lot about that. And I think the leverage ratio was 1 to 5. So for every dollar invested, it's 5. I think. Don't quote me on that, but it was quite a big leverage ratio.
It's one of those sort of mega shift things that we know by the end of the century we've got to be mostly renewable. Would you invest in that now? Would you invest early, probably at less cost than making a bottom adjustment later? Mostly the economists tell us that's a good idea. And then go hard at making a renewable energy industry, which you know is going to be part of the new economy, as Germany has, as China has, certainly America has a good going too. Anyway, okay. So thinking broader, also thinking a bit longer, thinking over the horizon. I've talked about mega trends. The papers are full of what's important for business today and this week and this month and sometimes this year, sometimes the end of the electoral sort of cycle, which is 3 years. But I've got a feeling that China and a few others are looking a bit further ahead than we are. Sometimes our business strategy is the same, very much about the quarterly stock price, and this happened to GE2, it was all about the quarter and making the quarterly numbers. And I could see in certain businesses who are just doing stupid things every quarter to make the numbers, and sooner or later the music stops, and that's not a good idea. We need to have at least some people, we've got to have people concentrating on the tactics, that's good. We need some people looking over the horizon, thinking about the strategy. And increasingly business strategy in Australia seems to me to be looking pretty tactical. So reset the horizon. I used to work for this 130-year-old company. They didn't get to be 130 years old by staying the same. It's a continual change, is the story. It's been written about by James Moody in a book called The Sixth Wave of Innovation. So the sixth industrial revolution is around resource productivity, around doing more with less. Companies typically live and die within a 30 or 40-year time span. Not many of them serve successive ways of innovation. The best ones are reinventing themselves now to do more with less this century. So, I talked about industry transitions. I think that obviously decarbonisation is important, but decentralisation of energy is pretty important, and I think for water as well. Electrification of transport is going to be pretty big. Aviation biofuels I think is important for that industry. That's the sort of stuff I've been working on. But also thinking a bit broader about sustainability, about your social licence to operate is important for business, and I'm doing a bit of work in that area as well. So today I'm doing some solar stuff because I think renewables will be important. I'm started a company to do distributed energy because I'm pretty sure distributed energy is going to be important. I'm working with a consultancy that works on social licence to operate with big industries that come out of the mining industry, but now we're working with pharmaceuticals and chemicals, a few other things. That's going to be pretty important. Look, I drive an electric car powered by solar because it's cool and, be the change you want to see in the world. That'll do me. Yes.
What is distributed energy? You said one
Yeah.
of the things that you want. What's
Distributed energy?
exactly?
All right, so it's
Tell me what the term.
local generation plus smart local energy management, so maybe a smart microgrid, storage, and things like demand response, getting control of the load as well as control of the generation. Generation can be intermittent, but actually the demand can be varied as well in real time, so it's sort of a smart grid story, plus energy efficiency, those three things. Efficiency, smart management, and local generation, distributed energy solutions.
For
Describe.
industrial use and
Doesn't matter.
consumer, or-
Look, it's better to have a mix. Diversity of load is good for that. But I think of it as a precinct energy solution and with a microgrid that's connected to the major grid, but largely living within its own resources. That's what I'm working on.
Thanks.
I think that with that, we conclude the presentations, and I don't know if anyone else has any further questions for our speakers.
Yeah, I've got a few. Are you guys going to be sticking around afterwards?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. You don't want to share them with Flor?
I don't think people will be that interested.
You never know.
Intrigued now.
Go.
Where do you guys see, or how important, first of all, do you think is government collaboration in regards to the global sustainability movement? Because I think it's pretty important, but I see for years and years that this is not working out. How do you see that issue evolving in the future?
I had Marks and Spencer, a big retailing company from the UK. I brought them across for the sustainability conference. This is just one answer, I bet the others answer as well. But I asked, so Adam Alban, the head of Plan A for their global sustainability strategy, I asked him the same question. I said, because you're coming from the UK, here we've got this, very challenging government situation. What would you say if someone threw this question at you? And he said, we don't rely on government, we dance to our own drumbeat and we are driving forward regardless of government. We're not sitting back and waiting for government's intervention or support, we're doing all our own sort of things, which is easy for a big retail chain like Marks and Spencer's to say, but it's a 100-point plan, it's very integrated, and they're driving that themselves. So that was his answer, but it doesn't really help us. But yeah, it's interesting to hear that.
I don't think it's ever wise to have your business strategy underpinned by a policy of the government of the day, because that changes, and we've seen it change pretty rapidly here. We do need some sort of stability and long-term planning from government. Set the rules and then get out of it is a good idea usually. And again, we've seen a bit of turbulence here on that stuff. But I think you need at least an equal weight leadership from business and leadership from civil society if we're going to get anywhere on those big challenges. Don't leave it to government. Governments aren't leaders, governments are by definition followers. You can convince business and people that something's right, then eventually government will get on board with their followers. And business can actually be leaders.
Yeah, and it's become very apparent to me as I've been working in the space that you've got your government, you've got business, and then you've got almost your this sort of sits side by side, the advocacy groups, your not-for-profits, and there's that continual push and pull between those three entities. And what you see is that incremental change coming from that, through that influence of one another, and the negotiations. It's always going to be that way. And then from a career perspective, you have to sort of look and think, well, where do I want to sit? Because I've obviously, from running my business, I've got pulled more into the not-for-profit side at times. Very much, heavily I found myself sitting, in a one-on-one, quite challenging one-on-one with an advocacy group, who want me to be doing more stuff. But then when I move over to the business side of things, it's got to be a lot more sort of practical, quantifiable. You've got to have tangible outcomes. You've got to be talking about the business case. And it depends on where you sit and where your passion lies as to where you want to be. Government's another story altogether. I don't really too much about that.
You mentioned that engaging the employees is very important to get a good culture of sustainability in the organization. And can you share any interesting KPIs or non-negotiables that you have implemented that kind of make sense to the CEO as well as for the employees that are?
Yeah, one of our biggest fans of Big Imagination, which was environmental sustainability within GE, was the HR department, because a lot of people care about the subject, particularly the new people they're trying to hire. When we come in and pitch at Agsm, those places, the potential employees ask us questions, put us on trial for our sustainability. So they care about that. If you can tap into people's purpose and they can reveal that they're actually making a difference to something bigger than themselves and something bigger than the business, that's pretty good for retention. So it's part of the employee value prop. And certainly at GE I was in charge of setting up local eco teams at each site and just tapping into the good ideas that the people already have. Not me at headquarters saying you should be doing this or that, but actually letting them work it out for themselves, the recycling, just the simple stuff. And that had great impact.
I'm making a note of some of the things because I can send some case studies actually, rather than go into too much detail now, because there's some really good ones, but I just off the top of my head, just have to, because Kimberly Clark, Jackie Feature McGee did a great presentation the other week in Melbourne, but it's very involved, so I need to send it through to you. It's great, and it drills down into how again from an HR perspective, linking to reward in terms of remuneration. So actually building in sustainability KPIs to people's bonus structures and things like that. So, but I can send that to you.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. Anyone
Question
else?
up the back? No.
Supratik?
No.
Do you have an answer?
No, I'm sorry.
I actually have another question. Do you actually see universities or any kind of education center getting much more involved into sustainability? Because for me, sustainability is not really a career on its own, but rather a facet of each job in the future, I think. So each job should evolve towards sustainability. So are the universities having any kind of initiatives to put that topic sustainability to all different kind of courses and not only offering the Master of Sustainability?
Yeah, so I can speak for the University of Sydney, where I'm at the moment. You're asking about the sustainability initiatives across campus? Sort of thing?
No, within the content of the course.
But yeah,
within curriculum?
Yeah.
Ah, yes, okay. So this is a passion of mine actually. So I was studying the MBA here at the Agsm, and I transitioned, I don't know if this is a good story, but I just, from me, in my personal business activities, I was hungry for knowledge around this, and so I transitioned across to the Masters of Business and Technology, and I was able to pick up sustainability specific subjects there, which satisfied my knowledge, and I did sort of renewable energy as well. I looked at business management for a sustainable environment, organisational sustainability. It was fantastic for me at that time, and so I actually ended up a graduate of the MBT. At the University of Sydney, we talk about it being embedded into curriculum, and we've got Anita Mitchell, the head of sustainability at Barangaroo, is one of our students. She was an Emerging Leaders winner, and she's a real advocate for getting it even more deeply embedded. But upcoming is the international programme. Look, at this stage, this is obviously for me one of my, objectives. I don't have influence at the moment, but I'm certainly making noises about how I can develop that. And we had a query about how much sustainability focus there was in the MBA at one of our information evenings the other day, and I was like, someone asked the question, come on, we need to get onto this. So I'm certainly looking at how I can, as I said, being humble, I've got minimal influence, but I'm certainly having those conversations, and that's what you can do, really.
I hang out at UTS a bit, and it sort of sits within the business school there, and certainly every business course has a bit of sustainability in it, and some more than others. But also, much broader than that, they've got the Institute of Sustainable Futures there that's doing good work, about 90 people or something across all of the, it's an institute, so it's across all the faculties, and I think they're doing pretty good work there in that sort of integrative thinking, design thinking. Wow.
We've also got the Business Enterprise Resource Network, which I only found out about recently, and there are some initiatives being delivered through that I sort of accidentally got invited to, and I didn't know it, so I sort of started exploring that more. It's interesting, the sort of, if you start looking for it and connecting with the people across the university, there are things that are happening that might be under a different guise than perhaps explicitly sustainability. So Business Enterprise Resource Network, that to me doesn't spell out sustainability explicitly. However, a lot of those seminars are sustainability centric. So
My experience with this program is that everything is, I'm in the executive program, and I'm pretty sure it's the same as the full-time program, but my experience is that everything is geared towards maximizing shareholder value, and ultimately I think as shareholder value starts to shift to become more ethically inclined, and the program will start to take that on board. But my experience with AGSM is everything is about adding value to the shareholder. And
one of my essays in the Masters of Business and Technology here was looking at the stakeholder versus shareholder debate. So I had a whole, so that was great. It was fantastic.
Do you know what's actually really interesting? I went to a panel a couple of days ago. It was talking about the divestment issues, but on the panel, one of the partners from Minter Ellison was talking about, and he goes, look, I don't care if climate change exists or not, and it was particularly focusing around superannuation funds and their fiduciary duty towards their members, and they were saying that the reality of climate change doesn't matter, but the fact that this is a fundamental and material risk that we have to incorporate and hedge against and take into consideration in our investment decision. So it's actually becoming a fundamental in their portfolio analysis, which is very exciting. So from this fossil fuel divestment issue that's come up really recently, they're saying a lot of their shareholders just they're calling in and they're going, well, what's going on? How are you addressing these issues? How is my portfolio hedged against these future potential risks? It doesn't matter if you believe in it or not.
I think the key, what you're saying, is to move it from a moral issue to more of a strategic issue. And we can sit here and bang on about it being a moral issue, and it is at the end of the day, but we need to make
people don't talk about ethical investment in most circles anymore. In finance, you don't you talk about in terms of integrating environmental, social, and governance issues. It's ESG, that's the term.
Okay.
So, and because that's a lot more bottom line focus and a long term and kind of risk, right? It's all about risk return. So
I think as well, if you ever, in this journey, I think I've learned as well, you've got to celebrate those small achievements and constantly be mindful of them. And like anything, it's incremental change, and it's knowing what to fight for, when to pull back, when to
to speak, when not to, how to influence, and how to be, you know, to celebrate, yeah, the small milestone. You look back, there is progress, it's just very slow sometimes, yeah.
But it's happening, and it is moving forward. I mean, even if we read about what's happening in China and the US, it's making big changes. China announced, I think it was about in March, that they're closing all coal-fired power stations around Beijing by 2020. It's huge. I mean, obviously we know that most factories aren't around Beijing, they're more inland, but still, it's a big signal.
Do you see the sustainability programs focused on industries, so specific industries taking them up, or is it across industries?
Across industries, from my experience. From my program, it was across industries.
Because the point that I'm driving at is, for a retailer, for example, a Coles or a Woolworth or Aldi, it makes sense to get into sustainability because at the end of the day, when the farmer grows whatever he grows at a certain cost, I keep my profitability the same. But as I extinguish resources, my costs go high. So for me, there's an added advantage to that.
I think the interesting thing is when you're looking at it like that from a career perspective, there are different drivers for different industry sectors, and it's understanding what those drivers are just through researching. Like you say, you know, you picked up on retail, but and we're talking about the finance sector, insurance, you know, reinsurance is huge from an environmental risk perspective. Climate change, you get deep into the climate change technicalities then when you're looking at IPCC reporting, you know, outcomes, etc. But I think that those drivers are what can be, you can look at where your interest lies when you look at those drivers, and then you gravitate towards that, move into that sector. But are you sort of...
I mean, for example, Vodafone. I did a 6-month internship with Vodafone, and you'd think, okay, what's sustainability with phones?
It was about driver safety.
Yeah, it was talking about driver safety in terms of improved handset functionality for individuals with disability. I mean, that's a sustainability issue.
Yeah, interesting.
Did you not look at product stewardship of the phone itself, or
yes, of course.
Or is that more like a
yes, they did. So that was more of a global.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so from a global perspective, Vodafone does look at that in terms of the supply chain, actually what goes into a phone, and they actually rank phones based on their eco-criteria.
Oh, okay.
But from a local perspective, that's just like an initiative we're working on.
This is so multifaceted.
I just wanted to add. I just wanted to add on that from my experience, for example, coming from a bank on the commercial side. Even it doesn't matter in which industry your client is, you still are going to have to put something on your report about their sustainability policies and their CSR. So, and that could be one of the triggers where you can actually not lend money to this company. So, in the end, the financial market is also acknowledging that.
And the UNPRI is really instrumental in that. So it's the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investment. The signatory list is growing every day, and they're essentially making commitments to evaluate companies based on their environmental, social, and governance criteria.
So I was just going to ask you, because we have heard different recommendations from you, from acknowledging what you really want to do and start taking coffees with everybody in that field, to what skills are required to get into the environment, and from you, and also to think about broadly about things and the trends in the world. I just wanted to ask you whether or not you want to share 2 words with us about, for an MBA student or MBA graduate who wants to cross the bridge into the sustainability industry, what would you recommend? The top 3 things that come to your mind, what would you recommend?
Network, and talk about your interests, because for my example, I just talked to as many people as possible and said that was, so it was actually a woman visiting from our London office who then knew I did my master's in sustainability, who then went back and said, actually the managing director of our Frankfurt office is interested in this.
Yeah, I think don't underestimate the impact of good questions. Just one example, our MBA students do a capstone, no it's not a capstone, sorry, they do an overseas project in China. And we were just discussing that in terms of how to, we were just discussing the project. I was discussing the project with one of them, and a couple of them I've asked them, did you, in the process of this, did you look at the community consultation piece, because it was going into a mining company going into a new territory, and I asked them about that community impact of moving into that new market. And they said, no, we didn't. That's really interesting though. So it's getting people to think about that, that the fact that they didn't isn't right or wrong at this point in time, but asking the question and getting them to think about that. So again, asking the questions of your supply chain, clients without alienating yourself, but asking the question, you might actually uncover things that do exist, that you perhaps you wouldn't have known about because you're not having those discussions. And then the other thing is case studies, I would say. So being inquisitive and asking questions around this in the right engaging way, and looking at whatever interests you, look at case studies, because there's always a case study and it's very inspiring. Backs up everything with facts.
Try and do what you're passionate about, and then do it passionately.
Well, on that note, I have to thank you for being here and for talking to us. I hope for you guys have been inspiring, motivational, or just interesting to hear. And once again, thank you so much. Please help welcome. We have some presents for you.
I like that.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's so kind. Thank you very much.
That's all right.
Yes.
Chris,
Thanks, mate. Enjoy it.
so,